Number 4. The Breakup. As depicted in the 1997 film depicting the Titanic disaster, the historic ship broke into two pieces as it sank into the icy water of the Atlantic Ocean. But new discoveries made by researchers suggest that instead of just two pieces, the Titanic actually split into multiple pieces. A naval architect named Roger Long analyzed the ship's hull that was first discovered resting on the seafloor in 1985. When he was interviewed by NBC News, he explained that when the bottom section of the Titanic's hull broke loose, the stern and bow split as well. He said that since the stern was still buoyant, it filled up with survivors but eventually sank into the ocean just 5 minutes after the rest of the boat. Researchers before had no reason to suspect that the ship broke into more than two pieces, but after sonar imaging of the wreck site was carried out by underwater robots in 2010, new details were revealed. The robots were owned by the RMS Titanic Incorporated, an organization set on preserving the famous ship's legacy. The company also conducted over 8 recovery and research expeditions to the Titanic wreck since it was first identified at the bottom of the ocean. The team from RMS Titanic Incorporated mapped 15 square miles of the ocean floor using sonar technology, which showed them images of the deteriorating ship. They found marks along the bottom of the seafloor suggesting that the stern likely rotated similarly to that of a helicopter blade as it sank. The vessel fell at a considerable speed for about 2.5 miles before the hull plunged deep into the sand. But the researchers determined that the bow of the ship drifted straight downwards, landing pretty gently on the seabed. The sections of the Titanic's hull, roughly 40 by 90 feet in length, were found in great condition considering the circumstances, and the red paint that covered the bottom part of the ship was still clearly visible. Based on research done on the shipwreck, we now know that the Titanic actually split up into 4 sections: the bow, stern, and the hull, which broke in half. This would have allowed water to seep in more quickly than what was previously believed. According to the new findings, the Titanic sank into the ocean way faster than historians originally thought. David Brown, a Titanic expert, estimated that it took about 20 minutes for the ship to get completely submerged in the water, but as it turns out, everything happened even quicker. By utilizing the sonar map of the shipwreck, investigators are now able to answer questions that were once thought impossible to explain. Now that they can clearly see exactly where every piece of the ship ended up, they can put together an accurate explanation as to what really happened. Computer-generated simulations have also been utilized to reenact the sinking of the Titanic and can even play the events in reverse. The simulation of the ship accurately shows the entire wreck, allowing investigators to understand every fatal flaw in the Titanic's design. The virtual reassembly of the boat was first shown off to the public in the History Channel's documentary that aired on April 15, 2012, the 100-year anniversary of the ship's sinking. Number 3. The mysterious Captain Smith. The mysterious whereabouts of the ship's captain, Edward Smith, has been highly debated since the Titanic first sank in 1912. There have been many eyewitness accounts from survivors claiming to have seen Captain Smith doing all kinds of things as the ship went down. But none of these claims seem to match up with stories from passengers, leaving several questions unanswered. Many survivors claim to have seen Smith jumping overboard before the ship submerged in the water. But there are other reports from people who supposedly saw the captain roaming the streets of Baltimore months after the tragedy happened. There are even some passengers who say they witnessed Smith shoot himself with a pistol shortly after being told of the ship's impending demise. The captain seems to have been reported in multiple places at once, which is not possible, so getting to the bottom of this mystery proved difficult for many investigators to solve. One of the first visual accounts of Smith before the Titanic completely sank was around 11:40 p.m. According to William Murdoch, the captain's first officer, he informed Smith of the collision with the infamous iceberg when they met on the bridge. This is allegedly when the captain and his crew started to understand the severity of the damage done. They reportedly came up with a plan for an emergency evacuation of the Titanic's passengers, but after this rendezvous with Murdoch, the captain's whereabouts became unclear. As the popular saying says, the captain goes down with his ship, but surprisingly, Smith's body was never found in the wreckage, and there is no definitive record of his death being confirmed. It seems that many have accepted the theory that he simply died with the other passengers as the vessel was submerged. Without evidence to prove or disprove this assumption, it's clear why there is so much mystery surrounding the Titanic's captain. After Smith was informed of the iceberg, the fourth officer under his command, Joseph G. Boxhall, incorrectly reported that no damage was done to the ship, a mistake that would soon be proven horribly wrong. Boxhall's words were almost immediately contradicted by Thomas Andrews, the ship's head designer, who told Captain Smith that 5 of the vessel's lower deck compartments had already been filled with water. This was a troubling statement, since the unsinkable Titanic was not equipped to stay above water if more than 4 of the compartments were flooded. The entire incident was reported to have happened within 20 short minutes, since the boat was apparently traveling at breakneck speed, much faster than it should have been. Only after water started spilling into the lower sections of the ship did Captain Smith tell passengers they were sinking. He declared that everyone on board had just 90 minutes to find a way off the vessel as water trickled in. But where was Smith during all of this chaos? Paul Loudon Brown, a maritime historian, claims to have seen the captain acting heroically while doing everything in his power to help passengers into lifeboats, prioritizing women and children first. But there are others who portray Smith's actions as ineffective and inactive during the panic. Even Brown confirms that the captain was letting lifeboats leave well under their maximum capacity. They were able to hold at least 65 people, but were being lowered into the water with just 27. Surviving crew members reported that Smith never even issued an abandoned ship order, which was customary under the circumstances, and most likely contributed to the large quantity of deaths that resulted from the tragedy. According to several eyewitness accounts, Captain Smith was visibly traumatized and in complete shock, which definitely could have impaired his decision-making abilities during the evacuation attempts. John Graves, a fireman who survived the disaster, said that Smith seemingly vanished into the ether amidst the ship's last hours, and he also failed to give out vital information to officers and crew. As people were being boarded onto lifeboats, several bridge officers were blissfully unaware of the severity of the situation after the collision. Given that there are so many contradicting accounts, it's nearly impossible to say for certain what Smith was doing in the Titanic's final moments. But the captain apparently told his crew that it's every man for himself after finishing his final tour of the deck. Then, at approximately 2:10 a.m., the captain supposedly made an announcement with a megaphone for passengers to look out for themselves before he made his way to the bridge by himself, according to steward Edward Brown. Just 5 minutes later, the entire boat was swallowed by the sea, and mysteriously, Smith's body was never found. It seems like we may never know the full truth regarding Captain Smith's final whereabouts and his last moments of life. And until his body is discovered, or more information is released on the Titanic tragedy, this mystery will likely remain unsolved. What do you think happened to Captain Edward Smith? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Number 2. The Six. One of the last scenes from the Titanic movie shows Jack Dawson slowly sinking into the chilly water as Rose desperately waits to be rescued by a lifeboat. But as it turns out, this was incredibly inaccurate. James Cameron, the film's director, actually based this scene on real events that happened to the last person rescued from the wreckage. This passenger was named Wing Sun Fong, one of only 6 Chinese passengers that survived the tragedy. While investigators gathered reports from the survivors of the Titanic in the years following the sinking, almost nothing was known about these 6 men. But over 110 years after the sinking of the ship, the true stories of these passengers were finally uncovered. A documentary called The Six aired in 2021 and was produced and directed by Tong Luo. Luo's vision for the documentary was to find out exactly what happened to the 6 Chinese survivors, since it seemed like they vanished after being rescued. Records regarding the men are few and far between, and even if Luo's team was given a name of the surviving passengers, they were all written in English. This means that the possible pronunciation of the names would have represented dozens of Chinese characters, and would have led to an endless list of men that may not have even been on the Titanic at all. Because of this, One of the 6 survivors was left unidentified in the documentary, a man named Fu Qiong, who was listed on the ship's registry. Additionally, these men were sent to another ship called the Annetta right after being rescued, according to one researcher named Cynthia Lee. This ship, apparently designated for the Chinese survivors, sailed to Cuba after the Titanic tragedy. This fact added yet another layer of difficulty to Luo's investigation. Sadly, surviving the sinking of the ship was not the greatest obstacle these men were forced to overcome in their lives. Throughout World War I, Chinese laborers traveled to Britain in order to fill the gaps left by local workers, many of whom went to battle. But the British government sent many Chinese seamen back to Asia after the war was finished due to economic downfall and labor redundancy. In the documentary, they explain that after landing in Cuba, 3 of the survivors went back to the UK. One of the men, Cheng Chip, unfortunately got pneumonia in 1914 and passed away in Britain. 2 of the others were identified as He Ling and Ah Lam, both of whom continued to work in the UK until 1920 when they were deported. Mysteriously, the men disappeared after boarding British ships going back to Asia. Situations like this arose in Canada and America as well. Another one of the Chinese survivors was named Bing Li. It's believed that he ended up in Canada where he opened his own coffee shop. The last passenger rescued from the Titanic, the man that's said to have inspired James Cameron, was named Feng Lang. But he'd changed his identity for immigration purposes, so when Luo contacted the man's living residence, he learned the survivor had 3 names in total: Lang Feng, Sen Feng, and Wing Sun Fong, his legal name. Fong apparently traveled to the US to become a merchant, and in the process, he cut off all ties to his motherland to become integrated and accepted in the new country. Many of the man's relatives were not even aware he had survived the Titanic, since most of his life was kept secret to avoid discrimination. This would have contributed to there being little to no documentation of these men after the Titanic tragedy. Number 1. SOS. On April 15, 1972, Lloyd Detmer, a radio operator on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt, received a strange SOS signal. Apparently, through his headphones, he heard a man calling out for someone to help in the sinking of the Titanic, an event that had happened exactly 60 years before. Detmer believed that this was an impractical and possibly sick joke, but out of curiosity, he began an investigation. Interestingly, while searching through military archives, he began to notice a pattern of similar signals received by other radio operators. In 1918, 1924, 1930, 1936, and 1942, the same strange SOS signals were reported. Based on this research, he concluded that the phantom crew of the Titanic was reaching out for help every 6 years. As he read through the radiograms documented by his colleagues, he realized that all of them claimed to have heard the voice of the Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, desperately calling out for rescue assistance. Making this strange discovery seemed to take a toll on Detmer, and after he ended his investigation, he was even treated for neurosis in Baltimore at a military clinic. But paranormal researchers latched onto this phenomenon and have come up with their own twisted theories regarding the tragedy. They claim the souls of the 1,500 victims who perished during the sinking of the Titanic have been caught in a temporal loop and are forced to relive the catastrophe every 6 years. But luckily, this is all just based on speculation, and the last time the mysterious signal was received was in 1996 by the Quebec ship. If these men and women were caught in some type of time loop, they seem to finally be resting at peace.
Number 9. A naked intruder. Early one morning in January of 2022, Canadian TikToker Bethany Coker noticed some mud in the driver's seat of her car. She figured that a homeless man had slept in her vehicle and steam cleaned the soiled upholstery, then carried on with her life as usual. 3 days later, she noticed that the car's windows were fogged up. When she got inside, a naked man she didn't recognize said, "Hey." From the time Coker discovered the mud on her seats until she found the homeless man a few days later, he had remained hidden in the trunk anytime she drove in her car. Coker asked him why she was in her trunk and why he was naked, to which he replied, "It's a rite of passage." When she asked the man how he got into the trunk, he said that he was the son of the Pope. At first, the 911 dispatcher responded to Coker's claim of a man being in her trunk for 3 days unnoticed with disbelief. But police certainly realized that she was telling the truth when they arrived at the scene to find the man's legs hanging partially out of the open trunk. In footage of the extremely bizarre encounter, he can be heard asking officers if he can put his pants on before exiting the trunk, to which they replied that they would appreciate if he did it. Coker told her followers that the man was a missing person and that the police took him to a psych ward. Number 8. Severed body parts. When Las Vegas police tried pulling over a Chevy pickup truck with an expired registration in December of 2021 and the driver sped off, they began to suspect that he might be guilty of more than a routine traffic violation. A police helicopter tracked the fleeing driver, who eventually ditched the Chevy and tried getting behind the wheel of an Avalanche. Officers managed to take the suspect into custody at that point and identified him as 58-year-old Eric Holland. They soon discovered that both of the vehicles were stolen. While searching the bed of the Avalanche, the police noticed some coolers that were taped shut and reeked of decomposition. Inside were garbage bags containing the dismembered remains of Holland's friend, 65-year-old Richard Miller, who was shot multiple times before being cut up and placed in the coolers. Footage from a local business showed Holland buying garbage bags and a power saw shortly after the murder. A National Park Service officer recalled speaking with a man who identified himself as Brian Long, who implied that his last conversation with Miller was a heated argument. Brian Long is an alias that Holland is known to use. Holland pleaded guilty to second-degree murder with a deadly weapon. According to the most recent update, he was still awaiting sentencing. Number 7. Baby snatching killer's murder weapon. On December 16, 2004, a very pregnant 23-year-old dog breeder named Bobby Jo Stinnett answered the door to whom she thought was a customer. An hour later, she was found dead in her Skidmore, Missouri home. It was clear that she was no longer pregnant, and her baby was nowhere to be found. Investigators quickly zeroed in on Lisa Montgomery, a woman from Kansas who had befriended Stinnett online over a shared love of dogs and who also claimed to be pregnant. Montgomery had posed as a customer named Darlene Fisher and arranged to go to the victim's house to buy a terrier on the day of the murder. When the FBI showed up at Montgomery's home to arrest her, she was holding an infant who she claimed she had just given birth to. But her story was quickly proven to be false, and she was charged with murder. Inside the trunk of her car, federal agents found a bag containing a bloody knife, human hair, and part of an umbilical cord. Montgomery's lawyers argued in court that their client was deranged when she committed the horrific crime, but the jury didn't buy it, and in 2007 Montgomery was found guilty of kidnapping resulting in death and sentenced to death by lethal injection. She appealed the case, and when her extensive mental health history was revealed, many opponents of the death penalty argued that her sentence should be reconsidered. But the court upheld the original decision, and in 2021 Montgomery was executed, making her the first female federal inmate to be put to death in 67 years. Number 6. Free car containing human corpse. In 2021, 2 men contacted the Copiah County Sheriff's Department in Mississippi to report that they'd found a naked corpse in an abandoned car. They told responding deputies that they found the car in the city of Byram with a sign on it that said "free car" and proceeded to drive to Copiah County before discovering the remains. Law enforcement identified the body as the car's owner, 34-year-old Anthony McCrillis. Neither his ID nor his cell phone were in the vehicle. McCrillis was last seen alive about a day earlier on footage from his home security camera. In a shocking twist, Byram police soon revealed that the 2 men who reported the discovery of McCrillis' body had lied about the free car sign to avoid being charged with auto theft. After questioning the pair, authorities charged 24-year-old Jordan Thompson and 21-year-old Joshua Hankins with several crimes, including tampering with evidence and auto theft. A third suspect, 21-year-old Kelly King, was also charged in connection with the case. No arrests have been made in direct connection with McCrillis' death, and law enforcement has remained tight-lipped about the case while urging the public to come forward with information. What would you do if you smelled something coming from the trunk of a car? Would you ignore it or call the police? Tell us in the comments and hit the subscribe button while you're at it. Number 5. Missing professional gambler. 53-year-old professional gambler Howard Farini was last seen at a dog racing track in Raynham, Massachusetts in August of 1991. He left with plans to return later that day, but he never did. Several days later, an employee at Logan Airport in Boston noticed a foul odor coming from a Cadillac parked on the 4th floor of a parking garage. Police found Farini's decomposing body in the trunk with a plastic bag over his head and injuries to his skull. A large amount of cash and valuable jewelry were found on Farini, indicating that his murder wasn't motivated by robbery. An investigation found that at least 2 people assaulted the victim at his home before ending up dead in his car trunk outside the airport. The case soon went cold, and it remained that way for nearly 3 decades despite investigators doing everything in their power to try bringing justice to the case. In 2021, police revisited the crime as part of an effort to solve cold cases with a combination of new DNA technology and tried-and-true detective work. With help from the FBI, they managed to identify a fingerprint on the bag that was used to suffocate Farini as belonging to Kevin Hanrahan, a career criminal who spent most of his adult life in and out of prison. Hanrahan was a known enforcer for the Providence-based Patriarcha crime family. Unfortunately, by the time the print was identified, it was far too late to arrest him in the case. As a result of his deviant lifestyle, he was shot to death in 1992. And while the discovery marks a major break in the case, there's at least one other perpetrator who has yet to be identified. Number 4. Carbon monoxide murders. In the early morning hours of April 20th, 1977, 65-year-old Harriet Carr found her husband Melvin Ted Carr dead in the garage of their Indianapolis home. His car was still running and there was a vacuum cleaner hose attached to the tailpipe and leading into the trunk, where Harriet found 3 bodies. Police concluded that the victims 24-year-old Karen Mills, her young child, and 17-year-old Sandra Harris were all murdered with carbon dioxide. Ted died from the same cause, but his death was ruled accidental. He had kidnapped the victims at gunpoint and assaulted them before murdering them. Detectives theorized that Ted's own demise came when he opened the trunk to check to see if the victims were dead or to begin disposing of their remains and inhaled too much carbon monoxide. As it turned out, Ted had a violent history. 30 years earlier, he was arrested for kidnapping a pair of hitchhikers and assaulting one of them, but the charges were ultimately dropped. He also did a short prison stint for kidnapping and was caught drawing up murder plans during his stay, but was released anyway. Ted was also suspected of killing mother-daughter duo Karen and Lois Williams in 1967 and attempting to lure a co-worker's wife to her death around the same time. These are just some of the crimes he fell under suspicion for, yet was never charged in connection with, leaving the world to wonder how many victims he had claimed during his lifetime without getting caught. Number 3. Suspiciously slain woman. In early of 2022, someone shot 40-year-old Charlie Marie Cool multiple times and left her body in the backseat of an abandoned car along a roadside in Nashville, Tennessee. By the time Cool's body was found, the vehicle had been parked in the same spot for 6 weeks, and her family had been trying to reach her to no avail. Her father, Charles Cool, told local station WKRN that he was surprised to learn that his daughter's body went undiscovered for so long, especially since the car was parked along a well-traveled road. Charles admitted that Charlie struggled with addiction, but said that he couldn't imagine why someone would want to kill her. Witnesses told investigators that they last saw the troubled woman in the same Dodge Charger she was found in, with a man identified as 31-year-old William J. Churchwell, after he allegedly told detectives that he shot her while inside the vehicle. At the time of the murder, he was free on a $25,000 bond in connection with an unrelated burglary. It was also discovered that the car Charlie's body was found in had been reported stolen as the result of a robbery in late 2021. Churchwell said that he was sitting in the front seat of the car when he turned around, pointed the gun at Charlie's head, closed his eyes, and fired. He also admitted that the victim was still talking after he shot her and that he got out of the car and fled the area. The suspect remains behind bars on a murder charge while awaiting the next steps in the case. Number 2. New Jersey homicide victim. In early 2022, police in Paterson, New Jersey, received a call about blood dripping from the trunk of a car. Inside the trunk, they found the brutally beaten remains of the car's owner, 38-year-old Stephanie DeJesus. Officers initially believed she had been shot, but a medical examiner ruled that she was bludgeoned to death. An investigation traced De Jesus' last known whereabouts to a home in Ottawa, where she was seen arriving on surveillance footage after leaving a nearby pharmacy. A little while later, a white SUV belonging to 24-year-old Joelle Martucci, one of the home's residents, pulled into the driveway. Both vehicles left about 2 hours later, according to court documents, which failed to specify who was driving the cars. Martucci told detectives that she entered the residence to find a large box or bag and a portion of the carpet she ripped out. She initially claimed that she never saw De Jesus' body, but she did observe Fisher and his father, Ali Gibson, carrying something large to the victim's car. Detectives executed a search warrant of the home where Martucci lived with her fiancé, Justin Fisher, and the couple's child. They subsequently charged Martucci, Fisher, and Gibson with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. 3 other suspects were later charged, including Fisher's brother, Ali Fisher, and his mother, Chloe Fisher. Everyone except Justin Fisher managed to get their charges reduced, eliminating their culpability in the murder. And Ali Fisher's charges were dropped completely after it was determined that he likely had no involvement in the crime. Justin still faces a murder charge and no motive has been revealed, leaving the case shrouded in unanswered questions. Number 1. Florida man's murdered roommate. After a couple who shared an apartment in Tampa went missing in 2016, their landlord entered the home to find it covered in blood. It was clear that a brutal crime had taken place. A few hours later, Hillsborough County Sheriff's deputies found one of the tenants, 44-year-old Kydell Weldon, sitting in a vehicle near the home. His clothing and hands were covered in blood. A search of the vehicle turned up a bloody knife, and inside the trunk were the remains of Weldon's partner, 45-year-old Tina Ryan. She had been stabbed multiple times and bludgeoned in the head. Authorities never disclosed a motive or specific details about the circumstances leading up to Ryan's death. Shortly after the murder, her daughter Samantha DeCastro told the Tampa Bay Times that her mother had become terrified of Weldon in the time leading up to her death. DeCastro said that Ryan was known to experience rough patches and had a difficult life, and that she was actively trying to get a new job and a new place to live so that she could escape Weldon. Sadly, that never happened, and for one reason or another, he felt compelled to end her life. But even Ryan's children were left with unanswered questions in the aftermath of the horrific slaying. DeCastro said that she hoped to someday gather the courage to write Weldon a letter in prison and ask him why he killed her mother. Weldon was found guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. At number 8, the Battle of Wuhan. Between 1937 and 1945, China and Japan fought each other in what became known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. The conflict was mainly fought on Chinese soil, where Japan had a history of invading and occupying territories. During the war's early stages, its largest, longest, and most significant battle took place. By the time the Battle of Wuhan began in 1938, several major Chinese had already fallen to the Japanese, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin. But Wuhan, the country's second largest city at the time, was still under Chinese control. Consequently, Wuhan became the Republic of China's de facto wartime capital. With its economy increasingly threatened by burdensome military costs, Japan decided to try seizing control of Wuhan by forcing Chinese resistance into submission as quickly as possible. In early 1938, the Japanese High Command ordered troops to close in on Wuhan from the north and south in preparation to attack the city. But the operation didn't go as quickly as the Japanese hoped. The Chinese fought back intensely, and it took several months for Wuhan to fall. By the time Japan secured its victory, both sides had incurred heavy losses to the tune of 400,000 Chinese casualties and 140,000 Japanese casualties. In the end, the Battle of Wuhan did little more than prolong the war and leave both sides mutually exhausted and depleted of resources. A strategic stalemate followed as the rest of the war was fought in the form of smaller, localized battles. Number 7. The Allied invasion of Normandy. On June 6, 1944, 156,000 Allied troops stormed the coast of Normandy, France, in a mission to free the country from Nazi control. Famously known as D-Day and codenamed Operation Overlord, it's remembered today as one of the largest amphibious invasions in history. More than 21,500 paratroopers landed along Normandy's beaches during the early morning hours to prepare for the seaborne assault. In the meantime, amphibious vehicles and landing crafts brought troops as close to the shore as possible, at which point the soldiers disembarked and charged toward the beach. Wave after wave of Allied troops arrived throughout the day and even after the initial invasion. By the end of June, an estimated 875,000 soldiers had disembarked at Normandy. The campaign was extremely successful, marking the beginning of the end of the war. But the D-Day invasion came at a cost to the Allies, who suffered at least 10,000 casualties on the first day, with 4,414 confirmed dead. Many of the soldiers who died hadn't even reached land yet, or had just arrived at the beach. The 78,000 German troops in the area lost 1,000 men, and civilian casualties are estimated at 3,000. Operation Overlord failed to achieve some of its objectives, including the capture of several Nazi-occupied coastal villages. But the Allied victory paved the way for continued successes in France and elsewhere throughout the war. Number 6. Battle of the Somme. In July 1916, British and French forces embarked on a joint mission to defeat the Germans on World War I's Western Front. It began with an Allied attack along the upper reaches of the River Somme in France. On the first day alone, the British suffered around 57,000 casualties, including over 19,000 deaths, making it the bloodiest day in British military history. The fighting continued for 141 days, with an estimated 3 million troops participating in the battle between both sides. By the time the battle was over, Allied forces had penetrated 6 miles into German territory, marking their largest territorial gain in 2 years. But the French military operations objectives to capture Péronne and Bapaume and to break the German line went unfulfilled. Over 1 million men were killed, wounded, or captured throughout the Battle of the Somme. The exact number of losses on each side is disputed to this day, along with the battle's necessity and significance, as well as its impact on the war. The British Imperial War Museum's website describes the battle as a strategic necessity during which British commanders learned valuable lessons that would contribute to the war's eventual Allied victory. It's an opinion shared by many despite the Allies' failure to break the German line. Opinions on who won the Battle of the Somme are also divided, with some experts labeling the outcome as indecisive. Others subscribe to the belief that the battle ended with an Allied victory, despite the immense costs of their gains. Hey, real quick, if you're new to the channel, welcome! Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like these. At number 5, First Battle of Kiev. The First Battle of Kiev began in August of 1941 as part of the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa. In what became known as the largest military encirclement in history, more than 500,000 German soldiers surrounded Kiev with tanks and on foot, with intentions to capture it. Numbering around 700,000 at the beginning of the battle, the Red Army initially fought back fiercely in an attempt to break the encirclement. But it soon became clear that they were at the mercy of the Germans, and within a month of the invasion, Kiev had effectively fallen. Soviet troops nevertheless continued to fight despite their dwindling resources and manpower. Some units tried to withdraw and were killed by the Germans. Altogether, Soviet losses totaled around 600,000, including both civilian and military deaths, those who were taken prisoner, and people who went missing. Only 15,000 troops escaped. Around 400 Red Army tanks were destroyed by the Germans, along with nearly 350 aircraft. Operation Barbarossa proved to be a major failure, arguably due to Hitler's decision to attack Kiev and other cities before targeting Moscow. But the First Battle of Kiev marked a decisive German victory that came at a massive cost to the Soviet Union. Number 4. The Battle of Verdun. World War I's longest battle, known as the Battle of Verdun, took place on the Western Front in France from February 21st to December 18th in 1916. Believing that the Allies would soon be majorly strengthened by British reinforcements, German General Erich von Falkenhayn set out to crush the French army. He targeted the ancient fortress city of Verdun, located along the River Meuse. The battle began in the early morning hours with a massive German artillery bombardment and a steady advancement of troops. By then, thousands of French soldiers had relocated to Verdun in anticipation of the attack. During the first phase of the battle, around 500,000 German troops attacked the French defensive line at the village of Douaumont. Despite the massive number of Germans, the French managed to hold their defenses. Upon realizing that the Allies were preparing for an attack on the Somme, the Germans kept the Battle of Verdun going as a way to slow down and disorganize the Allies' plans. This presented the French with the challenge of continuing to fight at Verdun in hopes of exhausting the Germans while effectively preparing for the Somme. Throughout the battle, the Germans captured numerous French strongholds including Fort Douaumont, the village of Vaux, the village of Cumières, and other areas. But the French refused to surrender, and the fighting dragged on for months in a resulting stalemate. The battle turned in favor of the French about halfway through, with the successful crushing of several German advances and attacks. Over the following months, the French retook much of its territory that had been captured by the Germans. By the time the battle ended in a French victory, the Allies had suffered over 370,000 losses, and German casualties numbered around 337,000, making Verdun one of the costliest battles in human history. Between 40 and 60 million shells were fired throughout the 10 months of fighting, and 9 villages were left completely ruined. Number 3. The Battle of Manila. The Allied effort to expel the Japanese from the Philippines during World War II lasted from October of 1944 to August of 1945. During that time, American forces saw the worst urban fighting that took place in the Pacific Theater throughout the entire war in a month-long engagement known as the Battle of Manila. It started on February 3, 1945, when American troops approached the capital city from all directions. The bombardment came as a surprise to General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the commander-in-chief of Japan's forces in the Philippines. He had devised no plan to defend Manila, which contained a large number of flammable wooden buildings and was home to around 1 million residents. Upon receiving word of the American advance, Yamashita ordered his troops to destroy vital bridges and installations and evacuate the city. But Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi ignored Yamashita's instructions and instead ordered the 12,500 men under his command to prepare defensive positions, cut down trees to form a runway, and get ready to fight. A growing number of Japanese soldiers committed to resisting the Americans, who were aided by Filipino fighters. The battle's worst fighting occurred during the Allied capture of a power plant near the banks of the Pasig River. The Allies also took control of the historic Manila Hotel, a police station, 2 churches, Manila City Hall, and a post office. The Allies won the battle, but their victory came at a cost of massive bloodshed, and the city was almost completely destroyed. An estimated 100,000 civilians lost their lives despite only around 1,000 American troops being killed and 5,565 being wounded. Japanese losses were counted at 16,665, but were most likely higher. Number 2. The Battle of Stalingrad. From August of 1942 to February of 1943, Nazi forces fought for control of the city of Stalingrad in southern Russia. Known today as Volgograd, the city was of major strategic importance to both the Allied and the Axis forces due to its location along the Volga River as a major industrial and transportation hub. The Germans saw capturing Stalingrad as a way to gain control of the Volga River and access the Caucasus oil fields at a time when their fuel supplies were dwindling. The attack began with a tank invasion and intense Luftwaffe air raids. By then, the Red Army was significantly weakened from its losses of both manpower and weaponry in previous battles against the Germans. On the first day alone, the Russians suffered around 200,000 losses. Heavy bombing continued as the opposing forces fought in the streets. Because there was no civilian evacuation of Stalingrad before the battle started, male residents were called upon to help fight, while women were recruited to dig trenches. But even with their help, the Nazis continued to wreak havoc on the city, effectively reducing it to ruins. Within a few months, Stalingrad was mostly under German control, and only around 20,000 Russian soldiers remained. Still, the Red Army refused to back down. The Russians eventually secured a victory with the help of vital reinforcements, who encircled the remaining 300,000 Axis troops in a two-pronged approach on both sides of the city. The blockade cut the Germans off from supplies, causing them to starve and run out of ammunition while Russia's brutal winter conditions set in. Hitler refused to let his troops surrender even after it became clear that the battle was a lost cause. By the time the fighting ended, the Axis powers had lost more than 500,000 men, including 91,000 soldiers who were taken prisoner. But the Red Army's victory came at a huge cost to the Russians, to the tune of an estimated 1.1 million casualties, including tens of thousands of civilians who were killed and tens of thousands more who were taken prisoner and ultimately died in concentration camps. Despite these massive losses, the battle marked an important turning point that turned the tide of the war in the Allies' favor. And at number 1, the Battle of Berlin. By April of 1945, the city of Berlin had already been pounded relentlessly by Allied bombing campaigns. In a bid to capture the city and seek revenge for the suffering of the Soviet people, 1.5 million Red Army soldiers encircled Berlin. By then, the Nazis had killed an estimated 25 million Soviet civilians and military members. But their power was dwindling rapidly, with a beleaguered force of just 95,000 German soldiers left to defend the city, including extremely young and elderly men. On April 16th, the Soviets attacked ruthlessly in what would become the war's last major offensive in Europe. By the 23rd, Berlin was completely surrounded by the Red Army. At best, all the Nazis could do was slow the Russians' advance. The Red Army overwhelmed Berlin with firepower, firing an estimated 2 million shells and leveling buildings with rockets and grenades. In the meantime, Hitler remained holed up at his so-called Führer bunker and continued ordering commands to fight the Russian siege at all costs. When it became crystal clear that Germany was not going to win the battle, he took his own life. The city officially surrendered on May 2nd, and the fighting ended on May 8th. German losses were estimated at around 50,000, and the Soviets counted over 80,000 dead or missing soldiers. Thanks for watching. Which one of these battles shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.